when I was in high school, I just became interested in spirituality in general. I started reading every book on every religion I could find. And before that, I used to never read books, so that was pretty different for me. And like if school assigned a fiction book, I'd read 5 pages and I'll be like, I'm going to come back to that like next month. That was a lot of reading. But when I started reading spiritual books and religious books, I read right through them one after another. And I always kind of debated with the philosophies. I understood some things. Other things I looked at, I'm like, I don't know if I really agree with that. And one day my mom, who's right here, had gotten this book, the name of a book, from a yoga class she went to. And she said, maybe you'd like to read this book. And it was Light on Life by B.K.S. Iyengar. I mean, most people probably know from Iyengar Light on Yoga, which is all yoga poses. But he wrote a book that's more yoga philosophy called Light on Life. And I read that book, and I was just so struck by the philosophy, how universal it was, how it applied to my life, how I could use it, how I could think about the ideas. And I was like, wow, I want to pursue this philosophy. So I started to just read more about the philosophy. I got his other book, Light on Yoga. I started practicing all the yoga postures. And because I thought, well, I don't know where I can study this thing called yoga. So eventually my mom said, well, do you want to come to a yoga class? So I went to Jim Cooper's yoga class. And it's more fun when he's here because then he gets embarrassed. But so I went to his class and I was doing yoga with him. And he kind of joked like, okay, well, can anyone, not anyone, he's like, okay, now put your foot behind your head. I think we were doing pigeon pose or something. He's like, now put your foot behind your head. And I put my foot behind my head and I was like, okay, now what? You know? And Jim was like, and not long after that, I started doing yoga teacher training at the studio, then with Still Point with Sarah and Vaz. And then I started teaching the yoga teacher training program, and then I decided to go to India to Bihar School of Yoga, which I said the other day too, if most people have heard of them, you've usually heard about their book, Asana Pranayama Mudra Bandha. That's from Bihar School of Yoga, but they have a lot of books. I went there, I lived there for 6 months. I kind of got introduced to the more mystical or esoteric kind of practices of yoga, whatever you want to call them. I saw chanting and I saw these different forms of worship and meditation, and at the time I really didn't understand them. There was something in me that appreciated them. If it had been a hard day, it had been a long day at the ashram, we did all kinds of things taking care of the ashram. Like there was no crew of people hired to take care of the facility. It was like whoever lived there also took care of it. And somehow through the chanting, through these different practices, they did fire ceremonies and all, I'd feel uplifted. I'd feel like, wow, now somehow the worries of the day are gone and the stress of the day are gone and I feel peaceful. But when I thought about it, I didn't necessarily really understand it all. I couldn't make sense of the practices. Like, what is chanting? What are these words? You'd read the English translation of the book and they were just kind of like plain translations. It'd be like, if anyone's ever heard the story of Ram and Hanuman, so I'm like, wait, there's like this monkey, Hanuman, and he's God, and there's this guy over here, Ram, and he's God, and Ram needs Hanuman's help, and like, how does that even make sense? Like, what? And how does God need God's help? I was just like, I don't really understand what any of this is trying to say to me, but for some reason I appreciate it. I had a particular experience when I was at the ashram. I also really studied Buddhist philosophy and liked it too, and one particular day, my mind was going back and forth doing all these philosophical ideas, these yogic ideas, these Buddhist ideas, these ideas I read in books there, and I couldn't really settle my mind, and it just kept going back and forth. And I looked at my mind and I was like, enough, this conversation really doesn't matter. But then my mind really did think it mattered, and then it just kept talking. And stop, there's no one listening to you. No one cares about your conversation, mind. But alas, the mind went on and on and on. And that particular day, we happened to go outside the ashram. The guru of that ashram used to be Swami Satyananda. Now it's Swami Niranjanananda. There actually might be another person there now. They kind of pass it down through the lineage. But at that time, it was Swami Niranjanananda. And we went out to the town to a temple, and he was giving a talk there. So we went to the temple, and I sat in the back, and he was speaking in Hindi, and I didn't understand one word of what he was saying. And it's not like it was a beautiful temple. Like it was like an outside temple, and there was a little cave there that they had a statue inside of, and I never went to see the statue. I just sat in the back and listened to him speaking in a language I completely did not understand, and still having this conversation in my head. And on different days of the week in the ashram, we would sing or chant mantras to different forms of divinity. And the one I liked the most was the Divine Mother, though I didn't really get any of it, maybe because I have a great mom. But I liked the Divine Mother the most, And so I had heard this temple was a temple for the Divine Mother, but like I said, I never went and saw the statue or anything. I'm just sitting in it. For whatever reason, I thought to myself for the first time, I just thought, I don't know, Divine Mother, if you're real or not real, or, what any of this is or what he's saying up there, but if you are, could you just make these thoughts stop? And the conversation in my head stopped. And I waited a few moments suspiciously, like, surely it will begin again in, 0.5 seconds. And it didn't. And I kind of felt resolved, even though I hadn't intellectually drawn any resolution to it. And I was really surprised. And so when I went back to the ashram, I asked a friend of mine, I had heard about this book called the Chandipat, which is a story of the Divine Mother. But it's not a book that we chanted in the ashram. I had just, by chance, heard of it. And so I asked my friend, who also happened to be from America, he's like one of 3 Americans in this place of like 500 people. And I said, I really want to read this book called the Chandipat. And he has this little bag he carries with him all the time. And he says, well, I just happen to carry that book with me all the time. So if you want, you can borrow it for like a few hours and read it, but then I need it back. And I was like, oh, you have the book right here? Okay, cool, So I got the book, and I thought that was really surprising. And right inside the front cover of the book is the translation of the title. And the translation of the title said, the Chandipat, the story of the Divine Mother, she who tears apart thoughts. And I thought about my experience, and I looked at the translation of the book, and I thought, that's a pretty weird coincidence. That really relates to my experience. So I became really determined to meet the person who had written this translation, because it was so serendipitous. And that was another Swami Satyananda, who's actually a Western man who's a guru, and he lives in California with another guru, Sri Ma. So when I came back to the United States, I went to California, and I was so enthralled with my experience there. In Bihar, the knowledge was great, the practices were great, but you were one person in a crowd of 500 hoping that your question you wrote on a piece of paper came up in a raffle. I mean, not really a raffle, but it felt like it, to be asked, to Swami Niranjanananda. But when I showed up in California, there was Sri Ma, there was Swami Satyananda, and here was me, another person, and another person. There were like 3 of us and 2 of them, and I could just talk to them and ask them my questions. And I thought, well, this is a little bit different of an experience. This is really great. And I was so taken by the answers I got there of how practical and understanding they had of all these things. Of not in a religious sense, but in how can we apply these in our own lives? Like, how do we look for the inspiration in these things? How do we use that? And there were so many concepts they explained, which were concepts I had heard long ago in yoga teacher training that were just the kind of like this nebulous statement, like, oh yeah, there are 5 koshas, there are 5 elements. You're like, oh cool, 5 koshas, let me write that down in my teacher training book, But then I heard this practical explanation of how did they use them in meditation, what is the process of? Oh wow, that really means something. That's really useful and applicable. And so I was so inspired. I was probably a sophomore or junior in college at the time that I started coming there every break I got. I took my last semester all online courses, so I moved to California and started staying at the ashram my last semester of college, and that was about 6 years ago. And I've lived there for about 6 years now and done all the practices and got to study it and appreciate it and understand it, and here I am today visiting my mom. And Rani, who's here with me today, also lived at the ashram for maybe the past year or 2, and she also does all the practices. She appreciates the side of things which I don't get as much, which is a great combination. She really appreciates the mystical side of things. There's a part of my brain that wants to fully understand every practical aspect of something before I do it. Like if someone's like, here's Om, you should chant Om, my brain would be like, but what does Om mean? And where did Om come from? And how did you get Om? So after that little introduction, I want to talk about, I practice a lot mantras, chanting, meditation, things that we talk about all the time, the 8 limbs of yoga, the 5 koshas. I mean, people talk about those in yoga teacher training a lot. They didn't all make sense to me before as they do now. And I'd like us to take a few of those concepts, mantra and all, and try applying them to things we do all the time, like a yoga practice or a meditation practice. So to start us off, now that we're starting into the talk of things, I'd like to ask the question, if anyone wants to answer, of what they think mantra means or what mantra means to them. If you've ever heard that word before, you've probably heard it before. But if you want to just take any sort of chance to say, what's your understanding of it?
Connecting direct to God.
Through mantra? Yeah. Yeah, it definitely can be. And that's the thing about it. People can approach it in so many ways. Many people use it. We use mantra with pranayama, like you're saying, to use our breath to connect it to a divine idea, whatever that is to someone. That's definitely a perspective of what mantra is. Anyone else have any experience of it? Do you guys chant Om in classes, or what do you think of what Om is?
So for me, I'm like, I don't necessarily understand it,
Mm-hmm.
and when I do it, I feel it. And I don't just feel on the outside, I feel on the inside.
Yeah, very cool. And it's a really interesting thing about spirituality. I was actually talking about the other day. Spirituality, even though we like to have these intellectual understandings of things, especially I really do, spirituality is kind of turned on its head from most things we know, in the sense of, normally in life we're like, what is the scientific objective answer? What is this thing? What is a yoga mat made of? I need to know, But in spirituality, things are kind of flipped on their head, because what really matters is the subjective, experiential side of things. Someone could sit here and say, Om means this, this, this. But that is less real than your experience of chanting and feeling what Om means. Because if you go back to Sanskrit, Om is not a defined word. It doesn't have a specific meaning. Different texts will give a different philosophical spin to it. A lot will say like, is the beginning, creation, U is the middle, preservation, is the ending, dissolution. But that's a philosophical idea to help you appreciate Om. It's not the final statement on what it is. The experience of the thing is, in a sense, more real than the objective statement of that Om is this. It's very much like poetry or art. No one can put an art piece on the wall and say, someone could give you an explanation if you're in an art museum or something, he drew this here as a symbol for this and that, etc. But that's not the final answer to what the art piece is. That's one scholar's interpretation of the art piece. You may look at the art piece and have a totally different appreciation for it. And no one can say that's real or not real. That's how you appreciate the art piece. The same thing when it comes to a poem. It's about a subjective, how do I experience this poem? No one can say this is the best poem, and this is what all these lines in this poem mean. Well, it's the best poem to you. When you say it's the best poem, you mean you really appreciate and like that poem. But it's a subjective experience of the poem. And it's the same in spirituality when it comes to mantras, when it comes to meditations. No one can say this is the most powerful mantra, this is the most powerful meditation. All they could mean by that is, gee, it really works for me and I really appreciate it. Now, they may say that in a way that might be confusing, because someone over here says, by the way, I have the best meditation. And someone over here says, by the way, I have the best meditation, the best mantra over here, the best. Those are just their experience of it. And for you, your experience might be different. And one of the beautiful things in the relationship I had with my gurus, that I got to live with them and see them in day-to-day life, is it's one thing to see someone on a stage say, this is how things are, this is the practice you do, and this is the fruit you get. And they're saying it, but you don't get to see their day-to-day life to know whether that's really the case or not. You kind of, okay, you're sitting on a stage saying it. I do think if I sat anyone on a stage, they would sit up straight and say nice things. That's what I would do too. Here I am trying my best. But when you get to see someone's day-to-day life, what's a good day like? What's a bad day like? What's a busy day like? What's it like when they stub their toe in the middle of doing 50 things? You can get a better appreciation for, gee, I really respect how this person conducts their day-to-day life. And that, from my perspective in our tradition, is what really is a guru, is someone you can see their life and say, gee, I really like what you've achieved spiritually. I really like how you react to people socially, in whatever way that is. And then you can say, how did you get like that? What did you do to reach that place of spirituality that you're centered in? What practices did you do? And they can tell you. And again, because it's subjective, maybe those practices really resonate and work for you, and maybe they don't work exactly the same for you. But at least if you know you have this person who you can see how they've organized their life, you can have and you see how they're conducting their life, and you respect and want to exemplify that, you can at least know, gee, I would really like to hear how you got there. And I would really like to apply some of those things. And it gives you a greater faith in applying those practices. Now, if I was going to define mantra, from our tradition, we say it comes from the words man and tra. Man means manas. If you've ever heard of the different parts of the mind, manas is the thinking, subjective part of the mind. And then tra is trayate, which means to take away. So manas trayate iti mantraha manas trayate is the mantra. That which takes away the thinking, subjective part of the mind. If you think about it like this, when we talk about pranayama, you're breathing all the time, right? So what's the difference between pranayama and breathing? Well, your breath goes on unconsciously all the time. Sometimes it's rapid when we're worried, sometimes it's slower when we're relaxed. But pranayama is the purposeful effort of controlling the rhythm of the breath. In the same way, this thinking part of the mind is saying things all the time. Sometimes it's rapid and flustered, sometimes it's a little bit more benign, but it's constantly, just like the breath, going on. It's making relations between things, it's jumping from this topic to that topic. But mantra takes away that, in the same way that pranayama takes away this erratic, uncontrolled breath, mantra takes away this erratic, uncontrolled thought process. So if you look at the limbs of yoga, which I assume most people have probably heard of in some level, you start with yam, which actually means to control your external circumstance. Let me make sure I have 10, 15, 30 minutes of time to do my yoga practice every day. Let me make sure I've carved out that slot of time so I don't feel like I'm rushing between things to get it in, because then I probably won't do it. I might know all the yoga poses, but if I don't make some sort of physical space and time in the day, it's probably not going to get done. Thank heaven that Jennifer has a yoga studio. Here we have a space where we know we can sit for this amount of time and do this practice. Then we have niyam, which says, I need to control myself to actually use that time and space I created. Because I might have a whole yoga studio, and I might have a whole 3 hours of free time, but I might use it all looking at my smartphone, or use it all talking with someone, and not actually use the time and space. Then comes the body. It's much easier to control my body than my mind, so I have the time, I have the space, I have the self-discipline. First, I'm going to make my body still. In the beginning, that probably means doing yoga postures, because if you just sit down for 15 minutes and try to meditate, maybe your hip hurts, maybe your knee hurts, maybe your back hurts. That's pretty distracting. You probably won't enjoy meditating on your back pain as much as you might meditating on a mantra or meditating on your breath. So we make our body as free from ailments as possible. The Yoga Sutra's classic statement on asana, which means actually a seat, is sukham sthiram asanam. Steady and free from pain, easy, is the asana. So we want to make our seat as steady and comfortable as possible so we don't have to think about the body. Now, after we've controlled the body, we move to the next, more subtle thing which we can still grasp, the breath. You can become aware of the breath and control it. It seems pretty easy, except that, sometimes we're aware of it, sometimes we're not. We try to be in control of it, and suddenly we realize we stop paying attention to it. But it's much more concrete than the mind. If I say, hold your breath, you can hold your breath. If I say hold your thoughts, you may or may not succeed at holding your thoughts for very long. After you regulate the breath, the thoughts actually become a little more regulated because you're kind of applying this amount of awareness, this amount of consciousness to one phenomenon that's constantly going on, and it makes you aware of this other phenomenon that's going on. And the brain has physiological components. If your heart rate is slowed down, if your body's slowed down and relaxed, your thoughts are going to be too. If you just think about, and I've used this example like way too many times recently, but if you think about you're hungry, you will have thoughts about food. You'll also be more irritable. Your mind is affected by your body's condition. Your back's in pain, you probably don't feel very joyful in your meditation. You probably feel pretty annoyed that your back's in pain. So if you have the body relaxed, you have the breath relaxed, you can move to the senses. Now the senses are pretty hard to control. They're usually jumping around, they're paying attention, there's a sound over here, there's a sensation in my foot, let me scoot a little bit, there's something to look at over there. The senses are pretty erratic. Yes, we control them, but at the same time, they're kind of a little out of control. It's hard to say, look at one point, don't let your eyes move, and then someone goes jumping on, and your eyes look. So from pranayama, we go to pratyahara, trying to draw the senses within. In different techniques, we do that in different ways. I'd say there's kind of two main ways that goes on. One is in a lot of meditation practices, you prep yourself by paying attention to all those things that are going on first, because then the mind kind of loses interest in them. Once it's acknowledged them all, it doesn't really like to stay with them. So and we'll maybe do one technique that has both today. So that's one way, is kind of acknowledging everything going on outside. And a lot of time, like if you heard, imagine if there was a lawnmower going on outside this window. If you didn't pay direct attention to it, your feeling would probably be, that's frustrating, that's annoying, that's distracting me from what I'm trying to do. But if you paid attention to it and realized, it's just a sound, it's not really a personal affront, doesn't really have any particular meaning, then the lawnmower noise could become less charged and less relevant. So sometimes paying attention to the things takes the sting out of them and allows you to stop having them be this distracting force over here. After pratyahara, the withdrawal of the senses, so the other kind of withdrawing the senses is kind of physically cloistering your senses. So here we are in this room. We've kind of subtracted a lot of distractions. If we were chanting Om, we'd also be filling, not only would we be saying Om, but we'd be filling our ears with the sound of Om, which also again kind of drowns out other distractions. So there are practices which sort of absorb your senses so that they start paying attention to more internal processes. Because when you first start saying Om, which is actually very interesting that you said, you hear this external sound. But when you get to the part, when you get to the Im, now you have more of this internal vibration. So your mind follows, in the sense, another sense of pratyahara, the external part of the senses to this internal vibration, and then listens to this nice silent experience in the mind. So that's another kind of path of pratyahara. Then we come to dharana. And dharana literally means to hold on to something. Like, technically this is dharana. It's not what they mean in the 8 limbs of yoga, but it is an example. So dharana means to hold on to something with your mind, which is, again, it's more subtle than the other things we just talked about. It's easier to put the body in one place, pay attention to the breath, even to cloister the senses, than it is to get the mind to stay on one thing. If you try to think of a beautiful flower, how long does that image stay in your mind before it just sort of dissolves or just sort of goes somewhere else? It's easy to put a thought in the mind, but it's another thing to keep it there. And dharana is the practice of trying to keep some particular thought or idea, and this could apply to any meditation technique, in the forefront of your mind. And of course, this will be aided if we followed the previous steps of yoga to get here, because since we controlled our life first, we know that there's not something else that we need to go think about. So at least we know we have permission to think about the thing we're meditating on. We know our body's in harmony, we have our breath in harmony, our senses are cloistered, so we have a good chance of thinking about the thing. In dharana, we say there's 3. So the difference between the final 3 limbs of yoga is in degrees. So in dharana, there's me. Say I'm meditating on this clock as the manifestation of time itself for some reason. It's my meditation technique at this moment. There's me. There's the object that I'm meditating on, and I'm aware of the fact that there's a process going on here. I'm trying to pay attention to the clock. So there's 3 things. There's me, the subject, there's the object of meditation, and then there's a process. There's a relationship between me and the object. That could be between me and my breath. I am trying to regulate my breath. We still have 3 there. Or I'm chanting Om. I'm aware that I'm doing this thing. But when we move from dharana to dhyan, which is the stage beyond dharana, holding something in your mind, you become so absorbed in the process of meditation that you don't think of it as a process. And we all may have felt this to various degrees sometime, but when you're chanting Om or you're doing some meditation techniques, sometimes you become so involved in it, you don't really think about time. You don't really think to yourself, I'm trying to pay attention to my breath, or I'm trying to pay attention to this thing. You just are. You are doing it. And so experientially, you just feel like there's me, and there's the object of meditation, whatever that may be, physical or metaphysical. There's only the 2. In reality, there's still kind of 3, but you're only really intimately aware of yourself and the thing you're meditating upon, and you don't really feel like you're making some purposeful process go on. And then finally in samadhi, which really technically can't be described, the idea is the two things become one. Subject and object become one. And the reason people say you can't really say what that is because words only describe common experiences. And when people had the experience of samadhi, people who practiced, they went on chanting or they went on meditating for long periods of time, they thought, gee, that's kind of different from everything else I've experienced, so how can I use a word to describe it? There was a really great guru, Swami Satchidananda of Yogaville, and he famously said that samadhi, or God, is like a blueberry pie. He said if someone has eaten a blueberry pie, you can say the word blueberry pie and we know what we're talking about. But if the other person hasn't eaten a blueberry pie, how do you describe the experience of eating a blueberry pie? You're like, well, it's sweet, but the crust is kind of, harder, and my talking about eating a blueberry pie, if you've never eaten one, is never going to be the equivalent of eating a blueberry pie. So because they couldn't describe sufficiently in words what the experience was, they took on the description of neti neti, which means not this, not that. Which basically, I assume the conversation went something like, so is samadhi like, no. But so then it's like, it's not though. And, they just, because it couldn't be anything that they could talk about, it was the negation of all the things they could talk about. And so mantra can be a technique of using all these limbs of yoga. And we'll start off by doing an asana practice where we're going to use mantra with our asana. And the way that that'll be the bridge for us to use all the limbs of yoga will be, obviously we've already done we've done yam and niyam, we're all here. We had the discipline to show up, we're doing great. So then we're going to do our asana, we're going to put our body in a particular shape. And we're going to keep it there for a moment so it's still, and hopefully it's not in too much pain. We're not doing dramatic postures. And then we're going to regulate our breath. We'll hold the posture for the length of one inhale and one exhale. And then on that exhale, we're going to chant the mantra. And so in that way, our body will be regulated, our breath will be regulated. And by remembering to inhale and then say the mantra, we've automatically got the inhale. And we've automatically got the exhale. And by listening to the sound of the mantra, we'll have that withdrawal of the senses, and we'll have the object to hold on to in our consciousness. Now the other steps happen or they don't, but we'll try our best to put all the limbs of yoga together through this practice. The mantra can be the aid of pranayama, and pranayama is the aid of the mantra. Whenever we chant mantras in our tradition, we almost always chant with pranayama. So even if I was chanting the Bhagavad Gita, we would inhale once, and then we'd chant 2 or 3 verses. And what would happen is, because all the verses have the same number of syllables, in the Bhagavad Gita, almost every verse has 32 syllables. Every exhale, if I read 2 verses with every exhale, will be the same length, because I'm reading the same number of syllables. So when we are doing our yoga, we inhale and then we chant a mantra on the exhale, because it's the same mantra, has the same number of syllables, it'll be the same length, our breath will be regulated. And an interesting thing is, the mantra in some ways is a little more tangible than your breath. Like I'm sure many of you have done yoga classes where you pay attention to your breath. It's a part of so many yoga classes, right? But do you pay attention to your breath the whole yoga class? Like when you get to the end, are you like, I know I've paid attention from every breath from beginning to end? Usually there are these moments where you're like intensely aware of paying attention to your breath, and then a little bit later you're like, oh yes, right. And you go back and forth. But if you're saying a mantra out loud, especially in a group like this, on your exhalation, it's really hard to miss it, because hearing the mantra is this kind of very external, intangible experience. It would be a little bit weird, if that's what we're doing, to suddenly inhale and then forget to say it. You'd probably notice that you forgot to do that, where you may not notice that you forgot to pay attention to your breath. So paying attention to the breath will be the root of practicing the mantra, but the mantra will also be the tool for remembering to pay attention to the breath. And whereas the breath will be the regulation of the inhalation and the exhalation, it'll be the pranayama, the mantra will be the attempt at the regulation of the thoughts. And I just want to explain a little bit more about that idea of manas. It'll be the regulation of the subjective thoughts. And so in yoga, there's a tradition that the mind is made of 4 kind of parts. It's an idea. It's not necessarily supposed to be like a scientific thing, but it's supposed to be a way of looking at our mind. And those parts are the idea of I, the ahamkar, the recollection of memories and experiences that we have, the chitta, our objective thoughts, the buddhi, and our subjective thoughts, the manas, which is what the mantra primarily deals with. And so what that means is, first, to think something, I need to have some concept that there's me. Second, whatever I think is informed by a whole collection of memories and experiences I have. So if you were to think about a newborn baby, if you put it in this room, it doesn't look around the room and see walls, floor, lights, people, yoga mats, because it hasn't heard those words and concepts. A newborn baby just sees light, and its brain doesn't have any means to register, oh, this is that thing, this is that thing. But for us, we have this whole collection of names and nouns and forms in our, we would say in yoga, our chitta. And then our buddhi, our objective thought, takes those collected names and forms in our memory and starts applying them to everything. So it doesn't necessarily say words, but even when you're looking right now, you may think, I'm not thinking anything. But your brain is telling you in each moment, window, statue, floor, electric socket, door, person, clothes. It's not saying those words, but it's dividing up everything you're seeing and hearing into these categories in your recollection. And so if you've ever read like the second verse of the Yoga Sutras, Yogas Chitta Vritti Nirodha, even that dividing up of things, which the mind is doing all the time, is a chitta vritti, is a movement in consciousness. And then the grossest kind of expression of the mind is the subjective thought. Now I have this idea of I have all these names and forms, and my mind's divided everything up. Now my mind starts to say things. Gee, this is a really nice yoga mat. I don't particularly like this splotch over here. Oh, wow, I really like the temperature in this room. Gee, that fan noise is kind of obnoxious. There's this subjective conversation that now goes on top of all these other things. And the mantra is the replacement for that conversation. Or it may not be the replacement for that conversation unless we're really into it, but it will at least be a consistent side conversation. So that even if our brain is still managing to say a bunch of other things while we're chanting it, we have a way to remove ourselves from this thought process over here and bring ourselves to a more equal, more focused place. Because sometimes we have some thought process going on and we have no means, we have nothing to remind us to get out of it. It's just going on and we think it's us. But the brain will say things even if you try not to. If you've ever practiced meditation before, you've probably experienced you're trying to focus on something, you're trying not to think, and yet you find you are thinking. But the mantra gives you some way to go, wait a second, I realize I'm thinking right now because I'm trying to say this, but my brain's over here talking about this, so I'm going to bring my awareness back over to this. And it gives you a technique to pull yourself out of those thoughts. Ideally, it replaces them, but at least it gives you a bridge out of them. I want to give anyone a chance to ask any questions before we start doing the practice, but it's also fun to talk about it after we do the practice. So, does anyone want to ask any question before we do it? And that's perfectly fair if you do. Otherwise, let's stand up. We're going to do a few yoga postures with mantra. So again, we start with the exhale. Inhale. Om Namah Shivaya, 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 lunge, left leg hold. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, down facing dog. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya. Come down through plank, inhale. Come up to cobra. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya. Inhale back to down dog. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya. Step forward, left leg. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya. Fold. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Inhale up. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. To center. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Inhale up. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Fold. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Left leg lunge. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Inhale, plank, stay there. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Lower down, inhale. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Cobra. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Down dog. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Right leg lunge. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Fold. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Come up. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. To center. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. We'll do 3 breaths here. Om Namah Shivaya. 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 I'll do this 10 more times. Om Namah Shivaya. 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 Sit quietly for a moment. And continue to say the mantra inside if you want, or you can just sit silently. So, Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. You can do the mantra with your lips, it might help even in the silent part. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya. Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya. Work. So again, find a comfortable posture. You don't have to stay in the exact same posture you're in before, but comfortable. Sukham Sthiram Asanam. Comfortable, steady posture. That's all we're going for here. And so again, we'll just close our eyes. We'll get in tune with our breath. And I always say that good inhalation starts with a good exhalation. And we're going to start at the bottom. Again, it's going to be Lam, Vam, Ram, Yam, Ham, Om. And also to try to get the vibration of things, some of you can experiment with too, is instead of saying like an M, Lam, you can say Lang with like an NG. Give you a little more of a vibration. So first will be Lam. Exhale completely. Inhale deeply. Lam, 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 lam. Vam, 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 vam. Ram, 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 ram. Yam, 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 yam. Hum, 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 hum. Om, 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 Om Lam Vam Ram Yam Ham Om Ham Yam Ram Vam Lam Inhale deeply. Sit quietly. The last technique we're going to do is Brahmar Pranayama, the humming bee breath. You'll use your hands to cover your eyes and your ears once I'm done talking. And we'll inhale and we'll begin with an Om, but right away we'll close our mouth and then we'll just stick with the sound of Om. We'll do this 5 times together. So cover your eyes and your ears. We'll exhale completely. Inhale deeply. Om. Slowly start to deepen your breath. Become aware of sounds and sensations. Bring the hands together, and we'll rub the hands together to create heat. And when you've created heat in your palms, place your palms over your closed eyes and just let the warmth relax the muscles around the eyes. And when you feel ready, you can slowly open your eyes. Return to this space for a moment again. So we had our little bit longer mantra as a statement. We had our bija mantras as a variety of vibrations in different parts of the body. And then we just had our Brahmar pranayama, which is the of Om. People actually call it makara, the sound of im, which was just the kind of internal vibration. And then hopefully, afterwards, you had just a feeling. And ultimately, we're moving towards that feeling. But interestingly, sometimes the more we do the practice of chanting or meditating, sometimes it might feel like, gee, if I sit here and say I'm going to chant for 30 minutes, it might feel like, why am I chanting so much? I could have had that feeling after 5 minutes of chanting. But kind of like if you were doing a cleanse, or if you were doing anything that took a certain amount of effort, if you put forth that effort for longer, even past the mind, when the mind wants to do it, you get somewhere a little deeper than where you got if you did it only ever for 5 minutes. And once you get to that place that takes you longer to get to, once you're done doing that practice in the 30 minutes, and you sit there and you feel that silence, and it's so much greater than we're even just feeling after doing it for, I don't know exactly how many minutes we did. I didn't count. 7 minutes, 10 minutes. It's an even greater silence, an even greater peace, and that sticks with you. And if you keep yourself clear, you can get back to that space too. So there's one kind of practice where we reconnect ourselves with that spot of ourselves we've gotten to many times. And there's another kind of practice where we try to push beyond where we've gone before and try to go somewhere more. We call those things sadhana, going. Sadhana actually comes from the root sad, which means to go right to a point, to go right somewhere, going to that space we know, that place of peace. And then we call it also, the other one we call tapasya, this kind of striving that's not always as comfortable, just as sometimes when you want your legs to be more flexible than they've ever been before, it's a little uncomfortable to stretch them that much. If you go to Jim Cooper's yoga class, his 15-minute pigeon might be uncomfortable. But once your hips are more flexible, they easily stay that flexible if you just do a little stretching here and there. But you have to do an extra amount of stretching to get further than you were before. And it's very much the same in meditation. To keep ourselves centered day to day, you don't necessarily have to do a lot to remind yourself of that place that you've gotten to many times, not just in this practice, but through whatever yoga practice you've done, through whatever meditation practice you've done. It's not that hard to get back there. But we always want to go somewhere further. Because we know if these guys are talking about dharana, dhyana, samadhi, if they've divided meditation up into this many levels, there must be something that we haven't quite gotten yet for them to have such a dramatic explanation of it. And so there's both of those practices, and both are really important to keep. And like anything, if we do it a little bit every day, I feel this way about yoga, I feel this way about meditation. If you do an hour of yoga twice a week, it's probably not as fruitful as if you did 15 minutes every day. That consistent little bit keeps you progressing forward. And in the same way with meditation, if you remind yourself, rather than doing a meditation retreat once a month, if you remind yourself little by little every day, you keep going back to that place you've been to, and you keep that place. And then you can go further from there. Just as with flexibility. If you bend over and touch your toes once a day, your hamstrings probably are going to stay at least as long as they are. If you never touch your hamstrings, if many, many days go by, you might reach down and touch your toes one day and find out, ow. It's been a while. And in the same way, if you don't keep some sort of little practice of meditation with you, some moment in the day where you reconnect, it gets a little bit harder to get back to that place. That doesn't mean you won't get back to it, it just means, just like with your hamstrings, you're going to have to make a greater effort to go there. And I feel like the more we experience that space, the more we like going there, the more we like staying there and not taking ourselves out of it, but also the more it becomes important to us to find the techniques that work for us to keep finding that place and to make that greater and brighter and more fun.
It's funny. This might be too technical, let me know if it is, but when teaching the mantra Om, one of my teachers originally said the first half of the exhalation should be the O sound, and the second half should be the humming sound. Students typically draw out the O sound and then right at the end. And then another person told me, just to start it off, and then the humming sound, and really draw out the humming sound. Is there a better way, one that you would teach someone, the rhythm of it? Or is it purely experiential?
It's interesting. I used to always tell people that everything in spirituality is always just experiential. And one time, there's a very interesting guy in this it wasn't like as formal as this, but in this conversation we were having, he said this really interesting thing to me. He said, I agree with you, he said, but I feel like there really is a reason to learn the frameworks and systems of things first, and then to explore wildly however you like. Like if you're to think about an instrument, I could say, hey, you can make any sound you want on the guitar. If it sounds nice, it's great. But it'd probably help you to learn the scales of the guitar first before you did that. In the same way, it's experiential. So Om could go any which way. That is the end-all be-all truth of it. But at the same time, there are some people who have chanted Om for a very long time. And they've done it in a great variety of ways, and they've said, gee, when I do it like this, it really works well, so I might recommend to you, before you just try doing it any which way, try doing it like this. And the commentaries I've heard on it is, one is there's Brahmar Pranayama, which we were just doing, which focuses on the and the other is that Om is split into 3 quarters, which is Ah with the mouth completely open, U with the mouth starting to close, and with the mouth shut. So it has 3 stages. But I've never heard anyone say they have to necessarily be of completely equal parts. The way I would actually teach it, if I was just concentrating on Om, my guru has taught that there's 2 classical kinds of pronunciation for a thing. There's a normal pronunciation, and then there's what's called a vicaric pronunciation. And that just kind of means a special pronunciation. But in a Vaikaric pronunciation, it's a little different. When we're in a yoga class together, the reason I think people concentrate on ah is because we can all make this tone together, and really hear it together. And is very internal. But if I was teaching someone to chant Om by themselves, so this is kind of, for me, it's a little different. Rather than being in a yoga class setting, if you were saying, how do you think you should say Om? I would actually say you would make the sound in such a way that you could feel the most vibration around the center of your third eye. And that could sound really weird to people listening to it, and it actually would probably flux between and back and forth. So the way my guru taught us to chant Om, and again, I'm going to chant it this way, and it's not meant to be pretty, and it's not meant to be, it doesn't work very well for everyone doing together, but it's for me, for a person personally, try to hear the vibration. We chant it with kind of that NG at the end, we would chant just trying as much as possible to feel the vibration of Om rather than the ah or the but going back and forth between the ah and the whatever is giving the most feeling there to feel it. That would be my answer, even though it's not an easy or as useful answer. Does that make sense?
That's very useful, yeah.
But you can imagine in a class, if you're in a class, you only say Om 3 times, there's a difference, we have this group energy, right? We were doing the Bhuta Shuddhi, chanting the mantras together. It's natural and it makes sense for us to all go Lam together, rather than to all be Lam, because, we have this group energy going on. So we gravitate towards what brings us all together, so we have this group energy. But when you're by yourself, you're not making the sound for anyone else to listen to, you're making it for you to feel. And Om, or any of these other bija seed mantras, the idea behind them philosophically is someone was deep in their meditation and they got to a particular place in their meditation and they heard some sound. That sound they heard inside was called a shabda, a sound, or a vibration even. And they felt that vibration, a nod. If you've ever heard people use nada, they've used that expression. But then they thought, well, gee, this is the sound that I heard in meditation that took me to this deep place, this vibration. But it's a vibration. How am I going to express it? How do you express the sound of that fan blowing? How do you explain that sound with voice? So they took the closest approximation they could get to that vibration, that sound, that nod, and they made it a bija mantra. And their greatest hope was, you'll take this bija mantra and you'll try to repeat it to listen to the vibration and the sound inside. That'll take you to that space of meditation.
Are those distinct areas? They have physical associations in the body specifically?
Those bija mantras we did.
Seed mantras.
Yes. The Bhuta Shuddhi mantras are each specific to their chakras. So ideally, when we're chanting Lam, Vam, and it takes some practice, but if you practice putting your awareness there, you will feel that there's a vibration there too with that mantra. Ideally, it is like that. Even if
experience all the way up?
When I chant it, most of the time I feel them where they're supposed to be felt. Now, part of that is if you think about Shavasana, and someone's calling off the parts of your body, right? You feel those parts of your body. You feel a little tingly just from your mind going there. So in one way, someone's saying these bij mantras are coordinated with these different parts, but as you practice, you also end up making the association in your mind. And for me, one way I feel it because it's there, and another way I feel it because I'm so used to putting my awareness there, that part of me I just feel when I say that seed mantra. But those, they both go hand in hand to help you get there. Yeah.
So when we did the seed...
Oh, and I want to be fair, just so anyone knows, I'm 5 minutes over. Okay, go ahead.
When we did the seed mantras, the Sahasrara or crown chakra is silent.
It's the experience. We didn't skip it. What did we do at the end?
Another Om.
Well, we sat silently in between. So the Sahasrar, the 1,000-petaled lotus, is not technically actually a chakra at all. It is the chakra idea equivalent of samadhi. So samadhi being one, being unexplainable, in the same way the Sahasrara chakra is just the representative of that. So like if you look at the petals on the chakras, like why is it 1,000-petaled? There are 54 petals if you add up all the petals in the chakras. There are 54 letters in Sanskrit. They're laid out upon the chakras. The philosophical idea being the letters make up all the names that you could possibly give to anything. So the names represent all energy. The letters represent all energy because they make up all the names you can have in creation. And the Sahasrar is 1,000-petaled. It's far beyond this 54-lettered creation that we can speak. They're saying it's 1,000-petaled, but they just mean to say it's infinite. Back then, 1,000 was a lot. Now we're like, 1,000, huh? That's a pretty specific number. They would have been like a Googleplex petaled lotus. You know, their idea was like 1,000 was kind of like a ridiculous number. Now we're kind of like, 1,000, that's not very big. But, you know. So it's that the experience then when we're not saying any mantra, when we're just feeling, we're moving towards that idea of the Sahasrara chakra. That's why it doesn't have technically a bija mantra. You'll see a lot of charts, they put ohms in it, but it doesn't really have one. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, please.
According to the rishis, there's actually 2 additional chakras before you get to the Sahasrara, and those are your energy bodies and your more subtle bodies, and the Sahasrara is where the soul enters and exits. So it's not, it's
Going.
more subtle, but I mean, what we do in the Sushruti is aligning ourselves to, it's a purification of the elements above the body, so we're focusing on the ones that are within ourselves.
There's even more.
That's why it's abstract. Anyone have anything else? And I won't run away right away too. But I do want to say namaste. Thank you all for coming and sharing with me.